Now I'm going to continue working with the core test program that I created in the last section of the course. Here in the command prompt, I'm going to type in code program.cs in order to open up this program.cs file in Visual Studio Code. I'll close the Explorer here. Come on, close. There we go. Okay, a little bit of a delay in closing there. Now, code is a surprisingly good middle ground between a basic text editor like Notepad and a rich development environment like Visual Studio. If you want to stay close to the code and keep control of the development process, you might consider using it for all your development work, particularly since it's free, open source, and available on all the platforms where .NET Core runs. In this course, I'm going to use it really only as a text editor, but keep in mind that it can do a lot more than I'll make a use of here. Now, I have installed the OmniSharp C# extension to code, which gives us this nice syntax highlighting, as well as some of the IntelliSense for some of the features of the C# programming language. And you can do more and add IntelliSense and a lot of different features. It's a surprisingly extensible development tool. Okay, so now I'm going to start adding a little bit of code to the application and start showing you more features of .NET Core and exploring what it can do. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add an additional line of code here. So I'll use console. Notice that I do get some basic IntelliSense. So I can console and write line. And in this case, what I'm going to do is say what time it is. And I'll use the datetime object and the now function there. And then I'm going to try to use the toShortTimeString method and include the semicolon because I want to display the short time value. Okay, so I will save that, and then I'll go back to my command prompt and execute .NET Run. Keep in mind that this is going to both build and attempt to run the application. But I have a problem. So the error that I get here, and I know it's an error because it's in bright red, is it says datetime does not contain a definition for toShortTimeString, and no extension method accepting a first argument of type datetime could be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? Now, if I was using the full .NET framework, I would think, okay, I misspelled it. Something's wrong. Maybe I didn't include an assembly. This is in the system assembly, so it's not something I would typically miss. But I wanted to do this deliberately because .NET Core does not include all of the features of the .NET framework. And so if you're a .NET framework developer, you're going to need to start getting used to what isn't there. Microsoft is trying to keep .NET Core to be small and compact and granular. And it's not implementing all of the methods that we've gotten used to. Now, for a method like toShortTimeString, that's really not a problem because the .NET framework, part of the reason it's so big and so bloated is that it has so many different ways of doing the same thing. So if I come back over here to code, what I can do instead, which gives me the exact same result that I want, is to specify that I want the time string. Okay, so datetime now returns a datetime object, which does have a toString method. That's part of the system.object within the .NET framework. And then I can include the format specifier in order to say what format I want the time in. So I'll go ahead and save that and come back over here and run it again. And assuming I haven't done something else wrong, it should compile successfully, and it does. And as you can see, it's 6:15 p.m. Okay, and that's actually the long time string format. So anyway, that's what I actually wanted. Okay, so Notice that I didn't do an explicit compilation step, but there is a .NET build command if I want to just build the project. Typically, I want to compile it and run it, so I just use .NET Run. So let's talk about what is built, what is compiled, and what the output is of that compilation step. The important thing here is that I'm not executing an executable file. I'm running the application because I'm here within the project directory, executing .NET Run, and that is going to execute the output of what I compiled in this application. So if I go over here to Windows Explorer, which I've already opened to that core test folder, you can see that I have the program.cs, a project.json, and project.lock.json. And I can drill down into the bin. I'm currently building by default a debug build. It's for the .NET Core App 1.0 version of that. And here is the output of building that project. As you can see, there's no exe. What I'm doing when I'm executing the .NET Run command is executing this core test.dll. So this is the code that is compiled into an assembly on the fly and stored in this bin folder as the DLL, which is then loaded by the .NET Runtime Loader that hosts the DLL when I do that .NET Run. The build process does produce binaries in the bin folder, but there's no mainline exe. .NET Run options determine whether the project is compiled or uses the existing assemblies from the bin folder. So when you .NET Build or .NET Run using the project.json file, it produces a platform-agnostic, portable set of assemblies that can execute on any platform that are loaded from .NET.exe when you run .NET Run. Okay, so keep in mind, I happen to be working with this on Windows, and so I'm looking at it in Windows Explorer. It's creating a Windows executable, a DLL. But the same sort of thing is going to be happening, creating native files on other platforms. Okay, so I'm just going to leave running the DLL at this point with a simple application, but it is possible to build your application to an exe by creating a platform-specific build. A number of directives in project.json can be used to specify the output targets. And then .NET Publish then creates a renamed .NET.exe that automatically launches the platform-specific project. Now, as I mentioned, this is a part of .NET Core that I'm not going to get into in any more detail here. But here is a real good blog post about the deployment options. And the biggest thing is that you can create both framework-dependent deployment as well as self-contained deployment. And you can read and see what each of those are. And the nice thing about this is that it describes each of those deployment methods as well as gives you steps for creating those using different options on the .NET Publish. Okay, and so you can create a release and debug build and continue to create a DLL, or you can create an exe on Windows. Okay, so that's a first look at the command line tools. The command line tooling is interesting in that it makes it much easier to create, build, and run .NET applications. But it's not just that you can perform the build process from the command line, but the fact that it's very easy to get started. You download a relatively small SDK, install it, scaffold a base project, then use any text editor or a full edition of Visual Studio to write your code and run. Compare that with the process of how you get started with the full version of .NET, which pretty much involves downloading Visual Studio or installing a slew of SDKs and figuring out the command line syntax to compile your code. Instead, you can use .NET.exe with a few simple commands, and that is a lot more approachable. And more importantly, you can be up and running very quickly. So the command line tools are there to make getting started easier and to appease those that like to work on a lower level than Visual Studio. And it's crucial to using Core on non-Windows platforms, providing a common base of operations. But that isn't to say that you have to build your application from the command line. You can still use Visual Studio, which then uses the command line tooling for creating the projects on your behalf. In fact, if you install the Visual Studio tooling for ASP.NET Core, you get Visual Studio integration like you would expect. So you can use the rich Visual Studio editor and your favorite tools and extensions to build your applications. It's important to understand, though, that the tooling is just a preview at this point, and Microsoft is pretty much guaranteed that it's going to be changing substantially. And I'll talk more about that a little later in the course. But behind the scenes, and what is nothing new, is that Visual Studio calls into these same command line tools to compile your project. This opens up the build process to tooling or your own build process management because you have easy access to the same tools that Visual Studio uses to build your project. Personally, as I've mentioned, I'm not a big command line kind of guy. I prefer visual tooling for most things, but I have to admit that with this new tooling in the command line, I find myself at the command line more often. Because the tooling is easy to use with the terse commands, it can often be quicker to restart an app from the command line than the Visual Studio run cycle. So beware, you might end up changing your development habits.